and welcome to this video on the CET 2023 overall analysis. Now, as you would already be knowing, CET 2023 happened on the 25th and the 26th of March this year, and it was conducted in 4 slots, 2 on each day. So let's have a look at the overview of the test and what exactly can we expect from this test. Now, if you look at the entirety of the test had no sectional breakup as such. So as was advised that there would be 75 questions from say analytical reasoning, 25 from abstract reasoning and 50 each from QA and VA, there was no demarcation in terms of the sections. However, what happened was the questions were presented to you in the form of islands in many cases. Meaning that, let's say for example, you are looking at the verbal ability and reading comprehension section. Now, all those questions would be distributed around the 75 or 80 questions that would have been presented, which meant that out of 75 or 80 questions, 50 questions would be from VARs, which meant that VARC had an island of sorts, right? So although it was not in the form of an exact section of 50 questions or it was not demarcated properly, you still had it in the form of more or less consecutive questions. Now, if you look at the marking scheme of that particular test, we had 1 mark per correct answer and there was no negative marking for incorrect answers. So it is definitely recommended that you go and mark each and every question, whether or not you are confident about the answer or not. Then in case of the level of difficulty, the test was spread across 4 slots over 2 days, and that meant that there was at least some difference in terms of the level of difficulty. Now, based on the insights that we have got from students and the mentors who took this test, day 1 can be said to be on the easier side compared to day 2, which was definitely a bit tougher. Now, the area distribution that was there wasn't consistent across the slots. So the 75, 25, 50, 50 split that we mentioned was not strictly adhered to. So in terms of the slots that we had, the area-wise breakup looks something like this. So in terms of quantitative aptitude, slots 1, 2 and 4 had broadly 46 or 50 questions, whereas slot 3 had 83 questions from quantitative ability and data interpretation. Similarly, if you look at logical reasoning, in slot 3, there were barely 40 questions, whereas in the other slots, there were 65 to 75 questions. Verbal ability more or less remained around the 50 to 60 mark, and abstract reasoning was consistently at 25 questions across slots. So overall, there were 200 questions that were present. If you look at the overall level of difficulty of the test was not something that can be termed as difficult. Yes, there were surprises. Yes, there were glitches, as we would discuss later. But in terms of the overall look and feel, we can safely say that the test was on the easier side. In terms of the quantitative ability and the data interpretation section, it was dominated by arithmetic, numbers, and algebra. And in most of the slots, these 3 areas contributed to roughly 25 to 30 questions. Right? In terms of slot 3 or day 2, slot 1, we can see that because there were more questions, definitely it was dominated by arithmetic, numbers, and algebra, so much that roughly 40 to 45 questions were from these areas. In terms of geometry, permutations and combinations and probability, again, across slots, if you looked at it, the minimum that were reported were 10 questions and the maximum that were reported were 18 in terms of the number of questions. In the last slot, the 4th slot that was there, or day 2, slot 2, there were no questions on data interpretation, which was slightly surprising. Whereas in the 3rd slot that was there, which had roughly 80 to 85 questions from quant, there were 23 questions from data interpretation. So that was something that was surprising and would have definitely favored people who were good at quant and data interpretation. Overall, if you look at the number of questions that were there across slots, again, it would have been a challenging affair for someone to go for the test and perform to the best of his or her ability. Purely because you can go to the test hoping for 50 questions from quant, especially if you are not good at quant. But if you have, say, 83 questions from quant, then it might surprise you. And again, a lot of people were surprised because of this. And obviously, some people would have reacted very well to this surprise, considering that QA might have been their stronghold. But a lot of people who find QA difficult would have suffered because of this imbalance in terms of the number of questions across slots. In terms of logical reasoning, overall analysis, it was dominated by independent questions. So traditionally, we have seen questions appearing in the form of sets when it comes to the CET. But this time, we saw a lot of questions that were independent in nature. The LR caselets that were present had roughly 20 to 25 questions across different slots. And if you look at the nature of the questions, the questions were fairly straightforward in nature. So the arrangement questions, which people are generally scared of when it comes to the CET, this year we saw them to be on the easier side. Some sets were so straightforward that they had 3 or 4 bullets that would have been given to you, and there was only one case that you would have to go through to answer a set of 5 or 6 questions. So it was that straightforward. In terms of the other LR areas, there were 20 to 40 questions that were reported across slots. Now, the topics that were asked included blood relations, coding, decoding, direction-based questions, number series, selection criteria, a couple of questions from clocks and calendars across all slots, symbol-based logic, critical reasoning, which can also be called verbal reasoning, and syllogisms. So these topics were present. What we did not see was sequential input-output based questions. So there were no surprises in terms of the question types or the level of difficulty. So it was pretty mainstream, just that you would have to be very quick and confident when it came to attempting these questions. Also, in some slots, LR was relatively easier compared to past CETs. And in some slots, we can say that the questions were present that were from difficult areas. So in a few slots, students have commented that there were sets that were based on games and tournaments. So although these sets were not very difficult, of course, games and tournaments is something that is considered to be a difficult topic, and that would have dissuaded a lot of people from attempting that particular set. Having said that, LR was not as difficult as it is perceived to be, or in the pre-2021 era, the level of difficulty that used to be there, it was not seen in this particular CET as well. In terms of abstract reasoning, there weren't a lot of surprises across most of these slots, because there were questions that were based on analogy, series, or figure out, and also some questions that were based on figuring out the relationship between pairs of diagrams. The number of AR questions was 25 across the different slots that were there, and obviously people would have gone into the test expecting this number, so it was not exactly a surprise. In one of these slots, however, we had this surprising comment that there was a domination of odd figure out questions. So some people went to the extent to say that there were 25 questions that were based on the odd figure out questions, which is generally considered to be the most tricky of the abstract reasoning question types. And that would have been a surprise, considering that not a lot of people are very good at abstract reasoning, and it takes a lot of time to solve these questions. If someone would have managed this particular question type or this particular section, then they would definitely would have done really well at the entire test. Now, the questions were overall easy to moderate. There were no random question types, no reflection based questions, no paper folding and cutting based questions, no dice based questions that were at the test. So the questions were overall easy to moderate, and someone who would have taken SimCETs would have seen most of these question types appearing in those SimCETs as well. It was that straightforward. In terms of verbal ability and reading comprehension, in different slots, 15 to 20 questions appeared from reading comprehension passages. Now, the split was as wide as, say, a 9+5 in one of the slots, wherein one reading comprehension had 9 questions, the other reading comprehension had 5 questions, to another slot wherein we had 5 questions each for each passage that was there. Vocabulary and grammar questions were approximately 30 in number if you look at the overall verbal ability bit, and the question types were fairly straightforward. So vocabulary questions involved fill in the blanks based questions, synonyms, antonyms, and so on. There was something that was present in terms of parts of speech, which meant you had to know your nouns, pronouns, verbs, adverbs, adjectives, prepositions, conjunctions, and so on. You also needed to be able to spot the error and be good in terms of grammar. However, the basics of grammar was what was tested. You need not have advanced hold on grammatical concepts. So that was the good part. Meanings of words, idioms, and arranging words in the form of a dictionary. So how they would appear, or in what order would they appear in a dictionary. These were basically the remaining question types that were present from the verbal ability part. Overall, the RCs were more difficult to crack, and the verbal part was in the easier side. So if you were someone who had a good command on vocabulary and had a decent ear for, say, grammar, then you would have done better compared to someone who was really good at RC, because the RCs were dense to read and the questions were also reportedly on the difficult side. So it would have been a wise decision for you to go and solve the verbal ability questions first and maybe keep the RCs for the second round. Now, in terms of the next steps that you need to take or that are going to happen in terms of CET 2023, the result should be declared within 2 to 3 weeks. So typically what we have seen is the result comes out within the 15th day of the test being conducted. And the irregularities that are there and retest chances that are there, again, there is a huge discussion that is going on. It has been covered in media. It has been covered by a lot of mentors. A lot of students have complained, and there have been obvious oversights or obvious errors in terms of the execution of the test. Now, having said that, we think it is highly improbable that there is going to be a retest. If it happens, it happens, but there is a high chance that it might not happen. So all the timer related issues that people might have had, wherein the timer started from the 180th minute and suddenly people figured out that the timer had run out and they did not have extra time as was promised by the timer. So all those things, we are not very confident that there is going to be a retest. So it's best to be mentally prepared that this eventuality is not going to happen. If it happens, then of course you can prepare again and you can appear for the test, but there is a high chance that these things are not going to happen. So it is recommended that you think about the other calls that you have on hand. You start preparing for your GDPI rounds, especially if you are going to apply for PGDM colleges, and stay focused on your preparation. If something happens, definitely we'll update you on the same as well. However, it's best to avoid all the noise and stick to your plans, because there is going to be a lot of furor that will be present across social media, and it is advisable that you don't participate in it actively, but register your protest as per the directions that would have been given to you. In terms of the admission process that happens, so post CET, there is a centralized admission process called the CAP rounds that will be conducted for admission to the respective B schools. So whichever B school accepts your CET score and offers an MMS program, that will happen through the CAP rounds. Now for that, you will have to know which colleges to apply to at a particular score, at a particular percentile, and so on. And that is something that we'll discuss on the next slide. Now, it is recommended that you also look at all your documents. So if you have, let's say, a category certificate that you need to present, a domicile certificate that you need to present, make sure that you have those things in hand. Because what happens is people realize at the very last moment that they need to present a particular document. And if people don't present that particular document during their verification round, then their again admission or the category stands to be cancelled, and you will not be able to avail the particular cutoff that pertains to that particular category. So make sure that you have all your documents in place. If possible, start working on them right now. The second thing that you need to do is, again, CET as a test is done. You don't really have much control over what is going to happen next. So it's best for you to focus on your GDPI calls if you have any, focus on the CMAT if you are going to take it, or focus on the PGDM programs that you believe you should be applying to. So as a blanket rule, if you are expecting more than 75 or 80 percentile at the CET, we would strongly recommend that you go and apply, or at least seriously think about the top 10 PGDM institutes in Mumbai or Maharashtra. Now, in terms of cutoffs, these are the actual CET 2022 cutoffs in terms of percentiles. Now, this year we saw a growth in terms of the number of takers, which is approximately a growth of 10 to 15% over what had happened last year. So the percentiles might get inflated by a bit. But last year, if you look at the percentiles that corresponded to the top 10 colleges that we have from Mumbai and Pune mostly, you'll be able to see the kind of percentiles that are the cutoffs for that particular college. So you can have a look at the cutoffs. You can maybe take a screenshot of this and look at the cutoff pertinent to your category. So open, OBC, SC, ST, All India seats, EWS and TFWS. So TFWS is the total fee waiver scheme that is a part of the admission process as well. So it was again recently introduced. So you might want to check that out as well. Now, in terms of CET 2023, the cutoffs, we expect the cutoffs to go up by 5 to 10 marks across categories this time, considering the reported difficulty. Because we have had a lot of students who would have attempted 160 to 170 questions genuinely this year. And that is something that we see will affect the cutoffs as well. And in terms of percentile as well, there is going to be an inflation, most probably considering the higher number of test takers. In terms of normalization, as it happens every year, it is done by equipercentile method. So what you will be compared with, or what your slot will be compared with the other slot, will be in terms of the percentiles at certain levels, and then there will be a mapping of the level of difficulty across slots. So it is generally a fair process that exists, but yes, it will be done by the equipercentile method. The scores that will be reported are normalized in nature. So let's say, for example, last year the topper was say 165 marks. So that 165 marks is not really a reflection of the number of marks that the student would have got or the number of attempts or the scaled score that would have been there. 165 is basically a benchmark which says that the highest, the topper of the test is marked to 165 and everything else follows. So that is basically how you're supposed to look at the test or supposed to look at the marks just in case the raw marks are shared. But again, last year we saw that the raw marks were not shared. Even last couple of years we have been seeing that the raw scores are not shared explicitly, and that's why it's not very easy to tell you what exactly is the score that will correspond to a particular percentile. Again, having said that, just to allay some of your fears, we have an indicative scores versus percentile bit for some of the relevant percentiles. So in terms of 99.90 or 99.92 percentile, which we believe should be the cutoff for JBIMS, we are expecting the raw score to be around 145 marks across slots. So if your slot would have been slightly difficult, then maybe around 140, 142 marks should be good enough. If your slot was on the easier slide, roughly 148 to 150 marks should have been good enough to get you into JBIMS. Now, in terms of 99.5 percentile, which is again a cutoff that a lot of these top 10 colleges have, it will correspond to mostly 132 marks out of 200. And 96th percentile, which is basically the absolute cutoff for the top 10 colleges for general candidates, as we had seen on the previous slide, we are expecting it to be somewhere around 110 marks. So that is basically what CET 2023 looked like. I hope all of you ended up doing well at the test and you had good support in terms of the SimCETs and the content that we provided throughout the season. Stay tuned for more such information on CET and also the updates as and when they come. All the best with your preparation, all the best for the results, and hope all of you do well. Thank you.